Hello there. Many of you know me. My name is Dr. Mark James Carpenter. I teach history and history education here at the University of Jamestown. I would ask, if you haven't already, go ahead and take a quick check, make sure you silence your devices, etc., as we have the last folks coming in and settling in. I'm going to switch to my dominant hand. There we go. Hello. I want to begin this evening by once again thanking the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center, and the campus outreach officer, Dr. Kierra, Crago-Schneider, for taking a chance on our community. We had really great attendance, we've had really great participation in classes, and we've been able to benefit from 2 days of programming for our students as well as for the public. We've had a number of classroom visits, and they've all been excellent. So really want to give our thanks to the U.S. Holocaust Museum and the many, many things that made the programming possible. So the program was made possible by the Sophie Davis Regional Campus Outreach Annual Series. It's also supported by the William J. Lowenberg Memorial Fellowship Fund on America, the Holocaust, and the Jews, and by the Judith B. and Burton P. Resnick Fund for the Study of Anti-Semitism. So if you could join me once again in a thank you loud enough that they can hear us over the live stream. Those of you who've been here this morning will find this familiar, but I do want to share just a little bit of my own brief personal reflections on what the humanities and the social sciences mean to me in this space. I'm an advocate for universities playing a role in public life and community spaces. I think we have a duty to connect universities to other spaces and places of learning. At least I feel one. And I'm particularly fond of what Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote in the 1957 Sweezy decision about what he framed as, and I quote, "the dependence of a free society on free universities." As he put it, insights into the mysteries of nature are born of hypothesis and speculation. The more so is this true in the pursuit of understanding the groping endeavors of what are called the social sciences, the concerns of which are man and society. For society's good, inquiries into these problems, speculations about them, stimulation in others of reflection upon them must be left as unfettered as possible. To Chief Justice Earl Warren and to me, unfettered inquiry was necessary for free universities, and free universities were necessary for a free society. Which is a long lead-in for me to say, in that spirit of openness, independence, and free inquiry, I'm incredibly excited to hear once again from these wonderful scholars and the opinions they express before, during, and after their activities. Here are their own. They do not represent and are not endorsed by the Mandel Center, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, or the University of Jamestown. Again, thank you all so much for being here, and please join me again in welcoming to the mic Dr. Kierra Crago-Schneider.
Hi, everyone. I have the honor of being the moderator for today's discussion, and so I will start with introductory remarks and introducing our speakers, and then I will jump right in. For some of you who were there this morning, this may sound familiar, but good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for joining us for this panel discussion that will focus on teaching challenging topics in the classroom. We really look forward to a robust interdisciplinary conversation about two distinct, well, three in this case, yet interesting intersecting histories of physical and social places of exclusion in Nazi Germany and the Great Plains in the 19th and 20th century, and specifically how educators like the ones joining me up here today deal with teaching these topics. The discussion is part of the Mandel Center's Regional Programming Initiative. The Mandel Center ensures that the field of Holocaust studies remains vital and vibrant for generations to come. Our conferences, workshops, and symposia assemble scholars from around the world in order to create a robust network of scholars and to focus on key topics that advance the field. Our fellowship program supports scholars using the museum's robust archival holdings for their work, foundational research projects such as the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, which some of you heard about today, and others create critical new knowledge on a large scale that only the museum can do. Academic Publications publishes and disseminates the most recent cutting-edge scholarship to audiences around the world. And our work on campuses, like these discussions, and with college faculty and institutions throughout North America, ensures that the Holocaust is taught across many different institutions, courses, and curricular contexts. Our regional programming initiative works to build institutional capacity for Holocaust studies by connecting colleges and universities throughout a particular region around common needs and common history. Please forgive me, my voice has been, this is the strongest it's been in 5 days. The Regional Programming Initiative cultivates interdisciplinary approaches to the Holocaust, while also discussing the unique histories of various geographical regions of North America during and around the Holocaust period. Both Holocaust studies and related fields are enriched through these discussions and focus on a range of experiences during this particular history. By discussing the different gray zones and points of intersection of these histories, both Holocaust studies and these related fields are enlivened through active engagement with one another. While these histories are distinct, by discussing them together, we can learn new things about how and why they unfolded. Ultimately, this collaborative approach involves college communities in rigorous, nuanced conversations around important historical questions from different methodological approaches. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum is so pleased to be working collaboratively with Jamestown University on this important program. And I have to say, just a personal note, we've had a wonderful experience since we have been here. Everybody has been really welcoming and wonderful. We began these discussions with Jamestown over a year ago, and we are so pleased to be working together to advance Holocaust studies in new ways and to new audiences. I would also like to thank all of our partner campuses across Great Plains for working on this and future programs, as well as all of the faculty who warmly welcomed us into your class and the students who heard us lecture yesterday and today. A special thank you, of course, goes out to Dr. Mark Carpenter and to Lisa Jackson. And now I have the privilege of introducing our outstanding panel of scholars who are joining us today on the stage. Each one brings expertise to this conversation. First, we welcome Dr. Elise Boxer, an enrolled citizen of the Fort Peck, Assiniboine, and Sioux tribes, and a Dakota from the Sisseton and Wahpeton bands. Dr. Boxer is the director of the Institute of Native American Studies and an associate professor in the Department of History and Native American Studies at the University of South Dakota. She earned her PhD in history from Arizona State University and has developed and revitalized the Native American Studies program. Dr. Boxer's scholarship critically examines Indigenous identity and settler colonialism, including her forthcoming manuscript from the University of Oklahoma Press, which will appear this fall, so go out and get it, titled Mormon Settler Colonialism, Inventing the Lamanite. Her work challenges historical narratives as seen in her publications, such as the Book of Mormon as Mormon Settler Colonialism, and This is the Place, Disrupting Mormon Settler Colonialism. She's also interested in preserving and teaching Dakota cultural traditions. We are also honored to be joined today by Dr. Edward B. Westermann, a Regents Professor of History at Texas A&M San Antonio, and a Piper Professor in 2023. Dr. Westermann earned his PhD from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and is a leading scholar on the Holocaust and military history. A former Fulbright Fellow at the Freie Universität of Berlin and a recipient of multiple prestigious research fellowships, his work has critically examined state violence, genocide, and war. His publications include Hitler's Ostkrieg and the Indian Wars, Competing Genocide and Conquest, Hitler's Police Battalions, Enforcing Racial War in the East, and Drunk on Genocide, Alcohol, and Mass Murder in Nazi Germany, which was awarded the 2023 Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research. We are also joined in a different capacity today by Dr. Rebecca Carter-Chan, Director of the Program on Ethics, Religion, and Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Dr. Carter-Chan's research focuses on Christian minority groups in Nazi Germany, including the Salvation Army, Quakers, Seventh-day Adventists, and Jehovah's Witnesses. She also serves on the board of directors of the Council of Centers on German Christian Relations and the steering committee of the Religion, Holocaust, and Genocide Unit at the American Academy of Religion. She is the co-editor of Religion, Ethno-Nationalism and Anti-Semitism in the Era of the Two World Wars, which came out in 2023 and was co-edited with Kevin Spicer. Her forthcoming book, Christian Internationalism and German Belonging, The Salvation Army from Imperial Germany to Nazism, will be published by the University of Wisconsin Press and will hit bookshelves in October. It is the 2024 winner of the Massey First Book Prize. So now that you know our speakers, I'm going to go ahead and jump in with our question. So the first question is, can each of you take a few minutes to introduce what you teach, where you teach, and what course you will discuss today? As a follow-up, how does your teaching relate to the title of this panel? And I'm going to go ahead and start with you, Dr. Westermann.
Thank you, and good afternoon to everybody. It's nice to see some faces from this morning back here, so thank you for joining us. I teach really the Holocaust, Nazi Germany. I've taught a gender war and genocide class. I also teach Civil War and Reconstruction. We're a regional public university in San Antonio with about 8,000 students now. The majority of our students, 70%, are first generation college students. The vast majority are from the south side of San Antonio, so we have a large Hispanic representation. Our students, like maybe some of the students here, are not only going to school, they have families and they're working. So we compensate a little bit in terms of class size. So we try to keep our class size at about 30 for our history classes, which really allows us to integrate more time in academic mentoring, which I think is important. As you could hear from the types of courses I teach, they deal with violence, they deal with abuse, they deal with power, they deal with racism. So those are all very strong kinds of topics to bring into the classroom. And I think that in terms of my students, they recognize from their own personal experience often the importance of these types of topics. They've experienced it in their own communities or have had experience themselves. So I think that it creates a pretty clear bond in terms of their interest in the topic when we raise these difficult subjects.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. I will be speaking from my experience in teaching Native American Studies. I am currently at the University of South Dakota, but I have taught at other institutions prior to that with the iteration of the Introduction to American Indian Studies. So I'm introducing students to not only our discipline, but broadly just a history of Indigenous people. I've taught this course also when I used to teach at University of Utah and then also Eastern Washington University. But at USD, where I currently teach, most of my students, well, our university is considered an R2. It's a liberal arts college. We are meant to serve the state and the region. Most of our students, we have about 13,000 students. That includes graduate students, and less than 1% of those students are American Indian students. So the Introduction to Native American Studies also fulfills a gen ed requirement for social sciences. So most of my students who are coming into my course are predominantly non-Indian. And this is kind of they take it because they're interested, but also, let's be honest, it fulfills a gen ed requirement. And I'm totally fine with that. I think that if I can, however I get students in the course, that's okay. And so those are kind of the students that I get, the classes I get. But I would just say that the challenges that I have, just very superficially, and we'll dive into more detail, is that many students, this is the first time that they are really encountering and being introduced to Indigenous history from Indigenous perspectives. And I use Indigenous sources and scholars in my class on purpose, simply because I want students to realize that there literally is a body of knowledge that has been created by Indigenous scholars, and that way they understand excuse me, at least from a disciplinary perspective, the way that we think about the formations of the United States and then the current political status of tribal nations today.
Hi, so I am going to talk about two different contexts. I taught in universities for about 4 years before I came to the museum, both in Canada and the United States. And I taught courses that were Introduction to the Holocaust, modern European history. I taught a course on rescue and resistance during the Holocaust. And I taught one course that is comparative in nature that I will refer to, I think, in my remarks today, and that is a course called Christianity, Mass Violence in Comparative Perspective, something along those lines. And so we looked at 10 or 12 different cases of mass atrocities and the role of religion in that. More recently, for the past 7 years at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, I teach all the time, although it's not in a university setting. I teach, we have classrooms, and I teach diverse audiences of religious audiences mostly, but this means people who have very little knowledge about the Holocaust when they walk into the museum, and people who are, intimately familiar with this history and have family connections to it. And so that's sort of the range. I will stop there for now. You can keep going.
Thank you all. So I'm going to put this in reverse order. So Rebecca, you're going to go first. Can each of you give a specific example of a classroom discussion that was stalled or stopped because the students found it challenging or difficult or uncomfortable? How did you move beyond this teaching obstacle to restart conversation, and what approaches were successful?
So I have had many sort of awkward moments and difficult moments in the classroom, but the one that I want to tell right now is difficult for a different reason, not because it was really emotional or political or divisive, but because students felt that they didn't have the language, the vocabulary, the knowledge to talk about what we were trying to talk about. And this is in the comparative genocide course. And I was, we were about a third of the way through the semester, and we were talking about all these different churches and denominations and branches of Christianity all over the world in these different contexts. And at one point, a student just said to me, "Can you just please give me an org chart of Christianity?" Because she just felt like she didn't understand, like Catholic, Protestant, all these different, Unitarians, like she just didn't know sort of how this all fit together. So I started explaining, the Protestant Reformation and saying all the, describing all of these different branches of Christianity. And when I said something about Episcopalians, she said to me, "Oh," she said, growing up, my parents said that we were Episcopalians. She said, "But I always thought that meant people who don't go to church very often." So I realized this is the level of religious literacy that we're working with many of our students. They simply don't know. They don't have the language and the background to be able to dive into these really difficult topics. And so I really value just religious literacy, basic knowledge of what we're talking about, just to equip students to be able to talk about the subject matter. So that's my story.
This is a really, I think, interesting question because I think there's so many examples at different moments I can pull from. But I think I'm going to go off of what you were sharing, and that idea of terminology becomes important. So one of the things I do in my class that I found very useful during week 1 is we define terms. There's all these terms that students encounter that I think are important, and ultimately, what I tell students is that, these terms change over time. I knew that these ideas exist, but I didn't know that there's a body of theory, right, and a framework that I could use to make sense of the experience of Indigenous people. So I make the assumption that my students coming into my classroom do not have any background information on Indigenous people. And so then what I start with really is kind of building ground up, the framework in which we're going to think about in colonization here in what is now the United States. So I start with this idea of imperialism, and I move through, and all these definitions that I use come from Indigenous scholars on how they define it, right? Whether we're talking about the theories and and the ideologies, but then ultimately how do they implement that? And I give them examples as a way like, okay, as I mentioned earlier, yeah, like this happens in boarding schools, this happens in policies, and I actually ask students, what are some examples of that? And it doesn't have to be the Indigenous context, it can be globally, because oftentimes they can point to other places in which this plays out. So I think terminology becomes empowering for most students, where they have that language to kind of articulate and to understand that there are structures in place that allow us to better understand experiences of Indigenous people. And the other part that I would say in general that I tell students, you are going to encounter things that are uncomfortable this semester. At some point it's going to be uncomfortable. And it could be that immediate, I don't believe this happened, I can't believe this happened, or it's simply, I don't think it's true, or why haven't I heard about it, which is the popular sentiment I get. But then I ask students to pause, think about what am I saying that is uncomfortable? What are you reading that it's uncomfortable? And sit in that uncomfortableness. Because that's really where growth and I feel like education happens, is because we're wrestling with those questions. Why? And let me go back to my examples of terminology. So we in my class talk about genocide. We wrestle with the various different definitions, the ways it plays out, but also then how you can then use other terms like ethnocide, right? And what does that mean, and what are examples of that? And I think, again, going back to that, the way I find it to be useful is where I have students kind of struggle through that and look at sources. And then I take the theory and then we apply that. And the second unit we do in my class is really what I call clashing worldviews. So I have them listen and read Indigenous creation stories or origin stories, because it gives an example of place, right, and connection to land. But then the other part is we're going to take this and now we're going to compare it to a different worldview. And we talk about the Spanish, and the Spanish coming in, especially to the Americas. I have them read Spanish sources, right? Look at images, journals, etc. And there is, again, a very different perspective. And it isn't to put on like a value system, right? It's more to have students come to the conclusions. This is what the Spanish have done here in the Americas. This is Indigenous perspective. And that's ultimately why there's going to be clashes. And that eventually, especially in the Spanish context, we have the dehumanization, right, of Indigenous people, the killing of Indigenous peoples, mission systems, etc. But I think that becomes a useful framework to kind of wrestle with some of these difficult topics in class.
Yeah, and kind of building off that, when you teach courses that are related to war and genocide, those are all already very difficult courses to think about. So I think really it's incumbent upon the instructor to kind of create at the very beginning kind of an idea. These are going to be tough topics, and they're not nice topics to think about, but they're part of the human experience. And to try to, one of the things that's an advantage with 30 students is you're able to kind of create a sense of community within the classroom that if it was 200 that you wouldn't be able to create in this sense. And I think when we think about difficult subjects, we've talked a lot about anti-Semitism, but when I talk to students, they try to figure out, well, where does it come from? And we can talk about religious anti-Semitism and the role of the Christian churches in developing that. We talk about economic anti-Semitism, and some of them, they've heard bits and pieces of some of this anti-Semitism, or they've seen it. But for my students, when I say social anti-Semitism as being kind of the idea that, oh yeah, I don't have anything against that group, I just don't want them to live in my neighborhood or to be in my country club. They get it because they are in neighborhoods and they've had experiences where they themselves have been excluded. So you can connect in some cases. It's not a one-to-one connection, but they can make connections. Racial anti-Semitism. So when I teach the Civil War and Reconstruction and I teach the Holocaust, oftentimes, I find myself in that course going back to the other course to talk about things where we see how race is constructed, what race means for given groups, and how it's implemented. And probably the most difficult, it asks for where do you have real trouble having a conversation? And organized state violence can be physical violence and killing. But if we look at the antebellum South, if we look at Nazi Germany and the occupation of Eastern Europe, sexual violence is a major issue. And that's a fraught issue to bring to the classroom. And it's fraught for a number of reasons, because you want to approach it in a way in which the dignity of those involved, it doesn't become kind of this, we're voyeuristically talking about this kind of violence. But also, to be quite honest, we have students, male and female, that have experience with sexual violence. And so trying to make that topic important, because it's part of genocide. It's part of annihilation. And those are difficult topics. And if we don't try to address them at some level, what we end up doing, I think, is we give students kind of an abbreviated picture. And I have a Holocaust survivor who is a good friend who has since passed away, Zev Weiss, and he sponsored a number of conferences. And if a historian were to sit up here today, if I were to use the word understand, talking about the Holocaust, he would have jumped up from that chair and he would have said immediately, right in the middle of my sentence, "You can't understand the Holocaust. You weren't there." And I get it intellectually what he meant by that. But you know what? I write about World War I and I try to understand World War I or World War II. But what he meant was the experiential difference that I didn't experience. So when I talk to students about physical violence or sexual violence, what we have to understand, and what I tell them why we're doing that, is because the lived experience of those survivors, the reason we can't understand it is because we can't imagine that that was part of their daily existence. And I think as historians, that's what we owe students, right? We owe them that conversation. But that's an extremely difficult conversation to have with students. And it requires a lot of trust on the part of the instructor and the students in kind of engendering that kind of conversation.
Thank you. As a follow-up, I just want to ask you guys, what do you think your students took away from your classes or take away from your classes that really stays with them after the course is over? I'm going to start with Elise.
So I think it really depends on students, right? Like in general, I find I get the spectrum of students who just go in there, right? They're there to fulfill the gen ed requirement, which is fine. And they pass the class, and then you get others who become more invested in it. And there's a few outcomes that I can think of that, to me, I think are profound as an educator, where you want students to take what they're learning in their class, realize that it matters, and how they apply it in their own lives or to the world around them. So recently, about 2 years ago, I had taught, again, a pretty large section of the Intro to American Indian Studies, and I had mostly non-native students, but a really outstanding student who was like upperclassmen who realized that if they left USD, they're going to miss their opportunity to learn, really about Native peoples. And their major was sustainability. And so they ventured into my class, took the class, and then that following summer, they also took a class offered by our criminal justice program, which is where they take students to New Zealand. And they go to New Zealand to look at the criminal justice system and look at Maori people. So they're getting kind of like this comparative experience of Indigenous people from a US context and then from a New Zealand or a Maori context. And from that class specifically, they have to create some type of policy or a paper, something from that course. And what this particular student and another student did was they wanted to make some policy changes. And the consensus was that had they not took either the intro that I offer or this other kind of study abroad, they would have walked away without learning anything really about Indigenous people. And then South Dakota is home to just 9 tribal nations that are federally recognized. And so they started to do interviews with fellow classmates. They did kind of like what they would call like stakeholder meetings. They interviewed people. They interviewed people across the College of Arts and Sciences. And they eventually put forth a proposal to require either at the Board of Regents level, initially was their proposal, and they felt like we're governed, all our Board of Regents schools in South Dakota are governed by our Board of Regents, including USD, and they felt that they wanted to make a requirement that all students going through USD should take some type of Native American Studies course. And I thought, was like, yes, fine. I was like, I've been bugging the administration every year. Anytime they have a listening session with our dean, the provost, oh, I'm there, and I'm advocating for Native American Studies, because my argument is like, I cannot be the only one teaching this, like literally. And it comes different when it comes from students, right? And so it was interesting because then the students then proposed this to student government. And they made that proposal and they passed a resolution. And from that resolution, what they found was just over 80% of USD students felt that this was a requirement that they would be willing to take. Now, unfortunately, Board of Regents said no. Broadly USD, we can't have anything different than Board of Regents policy. And so then they pushed for the College of Arts and Sciences. And that's kind of where it situates today, is that it's really up to me to implement their policy. And I'm trying to build relationships across the university. But to me, it was inspiring. Students who realized they would have been remiss had they not taken this particular class, and then eventually they, may change. And to me, I felt that was good from an administrative perspective. I think the other experience that I'd like to share is students who, one of the first jobs I had where they were very, I would say, adversarial in my class, and I was like, oh, this is just going to be a very tough quarter, but eventually they became a really good student in terms of that they opened their mind to think about things differently. And the reason why eventually I found that why the student was so resistant, because ultimately her and her husband owned land. They were a huge farming family. And that was what was made her uncomfortable, kind of tying it to the first question, right, was what she felt was that what I was sharing in class was a personal attack. And one of the things I do in my class was where I try to frame it more at, this is not a us versus them, this is looking at structures and how we exist within those structures. And then eventually, again, this is where when I call, like, I thought, you plant the seed and you see it years later. And eventually the student, they decided, her and her husband, that when they passed away, they would cede their land back to the Nez Perce tribe. And I thought that was just like a huge win. It was super cool. But there's different ways, and that's, I would say, one of my probably favorite kind of like wins, right, like as a teacher.
I think what I want them to take away from the class is that genocide is a process. It doesn't just happen. It happens because individuals make decisions or individuals don't make decisions. They don't stand up. It's something that's preventable. It's something that's not unique. And we say, we like to say never again with respect to the Holocaust, but we know that genocide, mass killing, ethnic cleansing continue. So I think that getting them to think about how those things develop. What are the stages? What are the decisions that happen? How, for example, does propaganda play a role? How does legislation play a role in establishing conditions? How does terror and intimidation play a role in establishing those conditions? So that's one thing that I think is important. I also think it's important to say that people, even in totalitarian societies, there are people who have the courage to say no. There are people who have the courage to stand up. Now, that's a minority of people, and it comes at a great cost often to those individuals who do that. But if there's really anything that should give us hope, is that even in the darkest periods, if we're talking about religious leaders and churches that may fail as institutions, some of those religious clerics, some of those religious figures still have the courage to stand up and do the right thing. And then the final thing that I like to stress, and we used to have Holocaust survivors come every spring. We have a talk, and unfortunately now we're at the position where we don't have any survivors in San Antonio who can come and speak at our university. But it was always very powerful for students to hear a story of someone who went through something unimaginable And then the idea that if that person got through their challenges, that the challenges that they have, I can't tell you how many times I would have students walk up to a survivor and give them a hug and say, you know, not only for what they shared, but what that helped them to think about. And I'll give one very personal story that really brought that home for me. So I had a non-traditional student. She was an older woman, and we were visiting the Holocaust Museum in San Antonio. And when we do that, I ask them if they want to bring significant other spouses, friends, because they've often been talking about the course. We do this near the end of the course. And she brought her husband. And so he sat there. We had the survivor speak. The next day in class, though, she came up to me and she said, Dr. Westermann, I really want to share something with you. She said, my husband was in the Vietnam War. She said, last night when we drove back after hearing the survivor was the first time that he spoke to me about his experience in the Vietnam War. And I thought that was so powerful because it shows that it shows the power of that human spirit and how someone who had an incredible experience that none of us would ever want to even contemplate, how their message was able to bridge other people's trauma. And I think that for me is just one example of the kind of the power of witnessing that I've seen.
So, religion is embedded in all aspects of life. It's there in all societies. But a lot of people, these days seem a little bit allergic to studying religion. And they seem to think that only people who are religious themselves ought to care about studying religion. And of course, religion is so important to understanding the Holocaust and other cases of mass violence and genocide. And so I want my students who are audiences, they're not always students, they're sometimes professionals, people who do come to this history with their own religious identity to be able to take an honest look and not have a really defensive response when they're confronted with maybe some unflattering or troubling things about their own religious tradition that they learn about. But I also want people to be able to look at another religious tradition and appreciate what was going on there. So a great example in our museum, there is a part that deals with Kristallnacht, or the November 1938 pogroms that happened all across Germany and Austria. And what this exhibit is trying to show is that the violence was not just against people. It certainly was against people and Kristallnacht and buildings, but it seemed to also be an attack on Jewish cultural and religious life. There were efforts to vandalize and burn and destroy houses of worship, and so we have this what I think is a powerful display of desecrated Torah scrolls. And so I always stop and I explain. And I don't think you don't have to be Jewish to understand. I think anyone who has any concept of a sacred object in a religion and what that means for that to be destroyed on purpose and desecrated, I think people, if they just stop for a moment and think about it, can understand that concept. It's really fundamental. And so just to sort of take the few minutes, you don't need a whole, book or course or, an understanding Torahs and all the rest. You just need to stop and think about it for a moment. So, yeah, that would be my answer.
Wonderful. So how do you guys create an environment where students feel comfortable sharing their perspectives on difficult issues with their peers and the professor? I'm going to open this one to you guys. Who wants to jump in?
Yeah, for me, it starts with the start of the class. So a lot of times the way I try to start my class is with a primary source. So a source from the time, and I don't start speaking about it. So I use what in educational vernacular is think, pair, share. I call it community building. But I have 2 or 3 students sit together, and they know this is coming, and they talk amongst themselves at first about what was interesting or important from that source. And the next class, they'll start the same way, but they have to do it with somebody else. So they have to get to know everybody in that class. And what I think that does is they're not isolated, and it also means that their peer-to-peer sharing is a lot less threatening, and they can validate some of their ideas with a peer because some of this is really difficult material. And then when I ask them, when I go around the room after they've had their about anywhere from 5 to 8 minutes of discussion, what I notice is that discussion has already taken place, and they've already started it, and they feel comfortable with those discussions in that way. So that's been really effective. I think another thing that we have to be careful in teaching these topics about the photos and the graphic images we use. And what I mean by that is there are times and ways in which that's important information, but I think also you have to think seriously about how you're incorporating it and why you're incorporating it. And so if you're looking at the ravine at Babin Yar, where 33,000 men, women, and children were killed over a 2-day period, in Kyiv, you can show the Red Army excavating that ravine, and you can see the bodies. You can also take Holocaust survivor artwork that depicts Babin Yar and think about it in another way as another type of non-traditional source that in my mind though is a very effective source instead of having the graphic image.
So my current work at the museum is a little bit different from these two professors because I don't have the luxury of having my students for a whole semester. I get them for half a day. And what else that you might not necessarily know is that so many of my audiences are coming to DC on a special trip, and they are visiting the African American Museum, the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. They're often visiting the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian and the Holocaust Museum. Sometimes the Museum of the Bible as well is paired in there for religious audiences. But it's a really intense trip, and they come with a purpose. They come because they feel this is important. Some religious folks refer to it as a pilgrimage. It's certainly a learning experience, but it's intense. And so by the time they get to the museum, they've already been in conversation about really difficult topics around race and identity and violence for a couple days. And then we do sometimes I give a tour, which is also very heavy and an emotional experience. So by the time we get to the classroom, I always just give space. I say, I'm happy to answer questions, like factual questions about this or that, and we can have a discussion, and maybe I will give a little presentation, and we'll do a sort of academic exercise. But first, we just need to sit and I give them space to process what they're feeling emotionally, which is not my natural instinct as an academic. I wouldn't necessarily do that in the university classroom, but I've learned that it's really necessary in a place like the museum.
I think my approach is similar in some ways to both. So the way I create community or safe space in my classroom is I really do believe that, students can ask questions at any time. And no question is a bad question. It may be uncomfortable, maybe worded poorly, but typically I'll take students' questions and then kind of repackage it to see I think what you're really getting at is this, right? And so let's talk about that. Or, that's a great question. Let's deconstruct that as a class, right? And so very similar to, right, Dr. Westermann, I also try to create community on the first day. If I expect my students to be vulnerable and to share, right, who they are, right, in class, then I do that myself. And I always tell students, there's nothing I'm going to ask you to do that I myself am not willing to do or share in the classroom. So I always begin with my introduction, the way in which I how I was raised, because I think that's important. We all come into these spaces, right, with our lived experience. We really are fundamentally who we are at that particular moment. And I, again, like I said, I try to create experiences where it's safe for everybody. And especially because most students don't have any really understanding of Indigenous histories or peoples, we kind of start just with that foundation. And I do similar exercises, right, where I always put them in small groups first, and then we kind of slowly build up our big groups, and eventually we're into our big group. But with the small groups, then it allows me to facilitate conversation. Okay, group number 1, what did you all come up with? Okay, great, who wants to add to that? And then it forces really everybody, because it's always safer in a small group to share. And so at least I know if you've had that conversation, but let's bring it to the larger classroom to have that. But I think what is most helpful for my students in general is that I'm okay if you ask questions that seem off the wall, because they're coming from a place, I think, of just genuine trying to understand. And like I tell my students, I'd rather you ask me questions than go out to other places to ask probably some inappropriate questions. So, but the goal is to create a community, a safe space, and that they're always welcome to reach out to me at any moment, and then we talk about that. And then other times, again, depending on your student in each class, what works for one class is not going to work for another. So you really have to be adept at kind of like either thinking on your feet or realizing this is just not going to work with this class. Let me try something differently. And especially in classes when I've had huge surveys at my first job, there was a section I remember being just so hostile, and it was one student, and I just remember that student sitting in the middle. It'd be like somebody in the middle of this audience just staring at me the entire time, and it was so uncomfortable, but I use that as a way to like, okay, so what is it really that makes you uncomfortable, and then how can we do that to create a safe space for you and for everybody, but also use that as a learning opportunity. But again, I try to be as open and transparent, and they literally can ask me anything, and I don't have a problem sharing information, even about my own personal life with my students.
If I could, I'd just like to take that point, because I want to give you a specific example of you build trust over time. So I had a student, we were talking about Primo Levi survival in Auschwitz, and we were talking about what happens to people who don't have food, who are food insecure, who are in these terrible conditions. And the student raised her hand and said, well, you know, I spent 2 months without a house, living outside, without food. And she said, I understand what that's like. And it was powerful because we talked here about where discomfort comes from. Everybody in that class was not ready for that kind of admission by somebody. And she was ready to share that, which was a very courageous thing to talk about, to relate it to a book and an experience that her lived experience could kind of connect with that. So that doesn't happen. Those moments do not happen often. But I think when we talk about, do we have community in the classroom, that to me was, at least that group was willing to be, that's an extremely vulnerable thing to share. And that student was willing to do that. So I very much appreciate it, but you could have heard a pin drop, you know, after she mentioned that. And then you as an instructor, you know, you have to kind of keep that conversation going, but acknowledge what that contribution did to help us understand the personal experience of the individual.
I'm just going to add quickly as you were talking so it's interesting, right, is like we're talking a lot about the content, right, of what we teach within our classrooms, but that's just one part of a student, right? Our students come to us as whole people, and they have a whole life that exists outside of our classroom. And so one of the things that I do in my classroom, and it really informs the way I teach, is for me like cultural value systems. And for me as a Dakota woman, we believe as Dakota people is that what's important to us is to be a good relative. How can we be a good relative to the people around us? But I take that philosophy and worldview in my classroom. How are my students, right? In a sense, how do I treat them as relatives? And what I realize is that many students, it's not just that they're struggling with maybe the content, it's that maybe they're just struggling with their educational experience. And what is a way that I can humanize them and to realize, okay, yeah, so maybe I have a due date here. Let's make it a little flexible, right? Because you got some other things. It's not the end of the world, because like I tell my students, I'm more interested in the ideas and the things that we talk about than like specific dates. And I know that's like contrary to us as historians, like we love our dates. But again, I think it's bringing that other part of who they are into the classroom and to see that I see them, right? And that I think is the other important part of creating community within our classrooms.
I want to remind everyone that we are nearing the question and answer time from you guys. So if you are here in person, if you are online on the back end, please send your questions forward. If you have a question and you're in the middle, please send it out towards the aisleway so we can jump right into your questions as soon as we finish with this part. And on that note, I am going to ask the group, many students and sometimes the public seek to make sense of particular histories in relation to other histories. How have you approached historical analogies in the classroom? What can be gained from examining similarities, differences, and gray zones of multiple histories? Do you want to start us off, Rebecca?
Sure. So sometimes when I've given tours to a local pastor in the DC area who was from Rwanda himself, and most of the people in his congregation were from Rwanda, and many of them were survivors of the 1994 genocide there. And so, to give a tour of the Holocaust Museum to that group I didn't know how it would go. But they, like so many of the groups that I work with, were so respectful. And they did make some connections to their own experience. Oh, that feels like something that happened in my context. But they were mostly just there to learn about the Holocaust on its own terms, which I thought was incredibly generous of them and quite remarkable. So those are the situations in which it goes really well. I think that where it gets sticky is that we all try to make sense of the past through what our own world looks like today. And so, current politics and that looks just like whatever, XYZ. That's where it gets trickier, because then you want to dive into the nuance of, and we've been discussing all day the nuance of different situations. So I would say that that's sort of a way that it can go really well, and an example where it's just really hard.
I talked a little bit about this earlier today, about how transnational approaches and looking at other disciplines, at other subjects, helps us to answer better or ask better questions about our own specific discipline. So I think that's an important part of it. I guess what I would end with, and since Rebecca mentioned this, I think it's an important point. A large part of our student body is also military affiliated. So we have veterans, we have spouses of veterans, and we have children of veterans. And the reason I bring that up is because I've had a number of veterans in my class, and from Afghanistan and Iraq. And as they read about war and genocide, whether it's the Holocaust, whether it's other cases of atrocity, they also often have a very painful reflection upon things that they've witnessed. And I've given you a lot of personal stories today. I'm going to give you one more. So we have at the end of the course a student rating, so it's anonymized. Students can give comments. And one of the books in our Holocaust class that we had read was Wendy Lauer's Hitler's Furies, and it talks about these German women, and they were killing children in the Warsaw Ghetto. And the idea of how could a woman in a genocidal society, well, women are also perpetrators in those societies. But what struck me in the comment, one of the students had shared that was a book, he said, as he wrote about a paragraph. He said, that was a book that I found, I had to put it down. And he had multiple tours in Iraq. And so he had seen things that this reminded him of. But again, what he said is, I appreciated this class because, again, he said it gave me the tools, and this was a word he used, to reconnect with my wife and talk about the topics. So, I don't think there's a redemptive lesson in the Holocaust. So there's no redemption in the murder of 6 million Jews or 500,000 Romani people or 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war. But I do think that when we teach in history especially, it's about the human experience and the human condition. And Elise, you talked about that earlier today. And it has to matter, right? It has to matter to the students that this is not just the dates. It's not just about something that happened in the past that doesn't matter anymore. It's about the human condition. And I think that ultimately, that's what looking at transnational history, looking at local histories, looking at other groups, it's about that human condition.
I think just to briefly add, I just would emphasize, I think students themselves like to make parallels to other histories because it helps them make sense of the things that they already know, right? And especially in the Indigenous context, like students prior to me actively including these ideas of like genocide, definitions of genocide, the ways in which they're expressed and play out, students were already making that comparison. Similar in the Rwanda experience, like in terms of students are already identifying in the world around us like different moments, right? And it's never meant to say one, right, is more like atrocious than another. It's simply, I think, or like on a scale, right? It's literally for them to understand like, oh, right, I could see it in this context, and maybe it's a little more nuanced here, but seeing the parallels helps them kind of draw that out. And I'll give you kind of two examples. The one I gave earlier today was really with boarding schools, right? And if we look at the different ways in which like the UN definition on the Declaration and the prevention and punishment of genocide, right? Like one of them talks about specifically the removal of children from one group to another. And students will point to that in terms of boarding schools where we are removing children, right, from their families, their homes, their communities, and we're moving into like oftentimes off-reservation boarding schools. So students can make that other parallel. The other parallel students also make is with looking at the sterilization of Indigenous women. And that happened really in the 1960s and 70s. There's a huge investigation that happens. There's a GAO report on that if you're interested. It's available online. But they uncover that, like the systemic, again, issues that are happening in terms of healthcare. By Indian Health Service, which is the primary and oftentimes only healthcare provider in Indian country. So they're able to make those, again, I think, connections that I think is powerful for students because then I think then they are, again, understanding. And I get the gray area where it's like challenging and difficult. But again, going back to the idea of like the human experience, like the fact is, right, that this has happened at so many different moments in so many different ways. And for them to understand like that larger collective history, I think is important for students. And like I said, I find it interesting that students oftentimes are making those connections on their own.
Okay, looks like we have a lot of questions from the audience, and we will try our best to get to them. I am going to start with this question. What do you do if the content is too much for students or a select few students, and they let you know that it is too much? Ed, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, I think that's, again, that's a tough one. I think that the title of the courses that I teach, they know that it's going to be, and we talk about it, this is going to be difficult material. But if they need to leave, for example, I get that. I understand that it's difficult. It's, we think about professors sometimes, and we think, well, professors just learn it and they teach it. Well, if you write a book about Nazis using alcohol, and you get some really bad manifestations of human behavior. And there are times when I've done my research where I've read something and I just put it down and I say, I'm done today. I can't go any further with this topic today because this image or this story is just too much, and I can't compartmentalize it. I've got to kind of just leave it alone. So I think that's what we have to give students room to do too, is to be able to process that, and if it's too much and they need to kind of move away from it, then I think people need to give them the space to do that. And I think that's one thing about dealing with trauma, especially that we recognize, because we read about trauma all the time. And so understanding that people will react to that trauma with their own trauma sometimes is important to note.
My students in my class always have the opportunity to leave, right? If there is something that it's just, too much for them. And then I encourage them to come back. There's moments when I've, come up with alternative assignments that will kind of get the main issue or concept across. But then it allows them to, again, I respect, my students' decision that it's just at that particular moment too much for them to process or to absorb. But I'm also going to answer this as also as an educator, and the idea I say that right in practical terms. Theoretically, as an educator, as I mentioned before, I tell my students I want you to sit in that uncomfortableness, understand why it's uncomfortable, and then hopefully push through that to get at why that's uncomfortable. But I don't think there's such a thing as things that we should restrict for students. I think it's up to students to look at the sources and make those, analyze those sources and make those decisions for themselves. I will say also the other hat I wear in a more personal note is I'm a parent of 3 boys, and my children are relatively young. I have a 9-year-old, almost 8-year-old in a few weeks, and then a 6-year-old. Now, we've encountered things in our local school district that as a historian, I'm just like, are we still really doing this? This is 2025. For example, Laurel Ingalls Wilder, the 3rd grade kids go through this whole unit. I've offered up, again, my expertise as a historian. I've offered up why that could be potentially problematic for Indigenous students. And it doesn't necessarily matter sometimes, but what I give my children is I arm them with all the information. And one thing I think is that I find that to be empowering. Much like my, discussion with my students on the first week with terminology, I find that if you give them those difficult, things, it actually is more powerful, because I'm afraid for my children when they go onto a school and to learn something that is not accurate nor true. So for example, my oldest son, when he was, I think, in kinder, brought home a book on Abraham Lincoln. It was around President's Day, so their elementary library put all these books out, and he selected that one. So he brought it home. And, we read it as our nighttime story that evening, and, this typical narrative that you would get that's age appropriate for him. But at the very end, I asked him, do you want to know something else about, Abraham Lincoln and what else he did? And he's like, sure. I said, okay. Well, Abraham Lincoln, while he did A, B, and C, he also ordered the largest hanging in U.S. history of Dakota people. Our relatives, 38 men were hung. And what does that mean? And what does that look like? And so we talked about that. We talked about the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 in very simple, kind of accessible terms, but I introduced that to him. And then much later, so it was last year, I, like many of you, scroll on my social media, and I was just, again, doom scrolling, and you see I stopped her. He's like, wait, stop. And I was like, first of all, why are you looking over my shoulder? But secondly, okay, we'll stop. And we scrolled, and it was horses. It was horses that were marking where you have people who do, there's a horse ride, right, where they follow that trail, and then they also have runners that follow the forced removal of our people. But eventually they arrive in Mankato. And we were looking at the horses. I said, oh, this is the horse ride. And I explained to him, and you could see him thinking about it. And he's like, oh, this is Abraham Lincoln. And I said, yes. And so the fact that at such a young age he was making those connections, I think was empowering for me, but also more importantly for him, because he's thinking about our history, right, critically and also from a different perspective, and something that he did not get, obviously, from that particular book.
Just really quickly, I would take the same approach, and I do take the same approach. I don't ever assume to know the background of people walking into a classroom that I'm in. And so if someone needs to step out, that's totally fine. And sometimes people do. And that is fine, and I don't question it. I am disappointed sometimes, though, and it's only happened a few times, if people want to leave because they feel offended or uncomfortable because they're being confronted with, they feel that their, religious identity in particular is being attacked, which is, of course, never our intention. So those situations are unfortunate, but again, you have to let them go too. If someone doesn't want to be there and decides it's too much, that they're not in a place where they're ready to confront what we're talking about, they are free to leave as well. It's only happened once in a week-long program. Someone made it halfway through the week and then left.
So I'm going to ask this question, which I think is kind of the flip of the question that we just asked, and I think that, Ed, you touched on it a little bit. The question was, does teaching such heavy topics take a toll on your mental health? And if so, how do you deal with it? And I'm actually going to take this one, and then I'll hand it over. So I have realized so I've worked at the museum for 9 years now. So in the last 9 years, that I was talking to Ed about this in the car, watch anything serious. So if there's an Oscar contender out there, I'm not going to be the one saying it. And when I come home, my husband always says, like, I heard about this great history show, or I heard about whatever it is. And I'm like, no, please put on Going Dutch, or please put on something that's like really stupid, funny, romantic. And I know that is because I all day have to deal with this content, not just for my profession, but I'm also a scholar myself. And so there's very little time to turn it off and to reboot. And so for me, most Holocaust movies that I end up seeing, and I do see them, I see during work time because it applies to my work, right? But then I'm very conscious that when I get on the train at the end of the day to go home, that I am reading some stupid romance novel, or that I am listening to something that I find interesting that's not at all related to anything having to do with persecution, and that is a way for me to protect myself. And I think that the thing that made me really realize how important that self-care is when I started crying at just random commercials. So they had one a few years ago that set me over that was a dad dropping his daughter off at college, and they went for a cup of coffee at McDonald's, and I found myself like just sobbing, and I realized, wait, if I am always in the serious, if I'm always thinking about persecution, if I'm always focused on the Holocaust, then I lose something myself, and that it's not overly healthy for me. So this is something I think that we can all agree does take a toll on our mental health. Do you want to come in?
I think I take a similar approach because my husband and I have different things that we like to watch, but sometimes he's like, why are you watching this? He's like, you're so smart and you teach. And I was like, because it's meant to like turn your brain off. I don't want to think about anything. But there's also parts too where sometimes I feel like, as a Dakota person, you can never fully turn it off, right? And so I switch it into looking at something where for me, I love the artistic side, what is a different part of, I feel like, my brain, where, like, if you see me wearing my ribbon skirt, I made my ribbon skirt, right? I teach cultural workshops to my students where it's a safe space, but in a different context, where we can exchange, like, just like cultural information that maybe some students never just really grew up with. So I spend a lot of time, and that's been a negotiation with my family and I, where I've embedded it into like my work week, where that's every Friday you'll find me in my building with my students. We are sewing, we're beading, we're doing other things. But I think self-care is important, and doing things that I think are important to you. And while an academic, I tell my students when it hits 5 o'clock, I'm done. You're lucky if you get an email of me from in the evening. I'll check it maybe. But I think we've got caught up just generally in immediate responses, right? We're so used to texting, we're so used to social media. And I teach my students too in terms of, I want to respect your time in the evening as well. So you should also at a certain point turn off your emails and not engage in that. And so that's the other thing I tell my students, I'll try to get you within 24 hours, but on the weekend, respect my time with my family. And that's literally at 5. Once I go home and leave campus, I'm invested with my family and my kids. And if they go to bed and I happen to have energy and I need to grade, then I'll grade. But if not, it's not the end of the world. Sorry, students. That's probably why sometimes you get assignments late is, we like to rest as well.
Yeah, I've had friends who stopped teaching the Holocaust because it was too difficult for them to continue to teach the class, and I understand that. I think there are certain traits that doctors have to be able to compartmentalize. They can't become emotionally involved with each one of their patients because they know, in fact, right, that they're going to lose some of those patients. I think we as historians sometimes, I definitely as a historian sometimes, try to compartmentalize the experience of what I'm looking at and look at it clinically, but I think that that's also a danger. So when I give a talk, for example, there's a slide to groups that I always end with, and it shows a young woman and a young boy, and they're in the forest, and there's a security service interrogator who's talking to them, and there's these German policemen behind them. So it's a so-called Judenjagd or Jew hunt. It's a picture of that. And this young woman, I don't know her name, I don't know the relationship. She's 20, maybe 22. There's a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. And I don't know the relationship, and I don't know specifically what happened to her. But I found that photo in the German archives, in a police archive that was labeled anti-partisan operations. So what I can tell you from looking at thousands of those reports, that is probably the moment in which her fate and that little boy's fate are being decided. And it might be as easy as where are your papers and this boy's in rackety clothes, and it might be as easy as asking that boy to drop his pants to see if he's circumcised, and that might be the last moment that those people are alive. And I think about that because we in academia, I have theories of masculinity, we have critical race theory, we have a lot of theories. But the human experience is what you have to remind yourself of. And the question is, who would be your 6,000,001? Well, that's my 6,000,001 and my 6,000,002. That picture reminds me, it's not about my theories, it's not about academics, it's about the people. And for my friends who were survivors, if I didn't teach it, I would feel like I let them down. Because their story's not around. And those survivors who have spoken at Texas A&M San Antonio, we always ended with our promise to them was to continue to tell their story, a promise to remember. And I think that really sums it up. We have an obligation to our friends to remember their stories.
Okay, so we have a handful more questions. One of them is kind of more general. So is there an Armenian genocide museum, like the Holocaust Museum? As far as I know, there is not. But have you heard anything about that?
No, the only thing that I think was very important from the U.S. government was that President Biden, you might remember, used the term Armenian genocide. I actually would publicly like to take credit for that, and I'll tell you why. Because a week before that happened, I wrote an editorial for the Houston Chronicle saying it's time to label it genocide. Now, he obviously did not read my editorial, but I think it's important. One of the things that genocide scholars, where you stand is where you sit. So, for example, Wilma Mankiller, who's a primary chief of the Cherokee tribe, when describing the Trail of Tears, she said, that was our Holocaust. And understanding from her perspective of her community that was like a Holocaust for them, I think is important. But I think it's equally important, Elise was talking about how UN Resolution 260, people get wrapped up over that definition and specific intent. And what happens, I think, sometimes is that we create this artificial barrier where we say if it's not considered genocide, it's not important. So war crimes, massacres, Sand Creek, whatever we want to talk about, well, that's less. Genocide only is the thing that makes it bad, right? And I think that's a fallacy. I think that we should care about the things that aren't genocide because they are also crimes against humanity. They are also war crimes. And those are the things that we can confront, right? But a lot of time we spend up arguing so much about whether it's genocide or not that the real human experience of other people and massacres get effaced in an academic discussion about definitions.
Okay, so how do you teach difficult parts of history, mass murder, genocide, Holocaust, etc., while being unbiased and trying to explain multiple perspectives? And I guess I would add, is that possible?
Well, you have multiple sources. That's how we do it. We share multiple perspectives by giving voice to through the sources that we put in front of the students. That's the simple answer. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree that that's the question with students, right, that often have, especially historians like my students, where I teach the capstone class for both Native American Studies and then our history majors, but it's that idea of being objective, right? Is it possibly to be objective? And that's kind of what that question reminds me, the idea of being unbiased. I don't think it is at all, right? All of us come from our own lived experiences, and how we read things is going to be based within that framework. I think we can strive, right, to be as inclusive in terms of there's so many different sources, there's so many different perspectives, right? And you can look at that in any different historical event, especially, well, I guess taking a somewhat regional example of Battle of Greasy Grass, right? Or Battle of Little Bighorn. Again, language matters on how we talk about that particular, event and moment, but how does it change if we move beyond just, the military perspective? What happens as we start to include, right, indigenous voices, oral histories, right, from that particular battle, I think then changes, right? But I don't think it's ever possible to be completely objective. I think you can at least preface your work to say this is the position I'm coming from, and the ways in which I'm looking at the past.
Yeah, I think this also kind of relates to the earlier question. If we kind of look at what's known as the canon of accepted genocide, we think about Rwanda, we think about the Holocaust, we think about Cambodia, we think about the Armenian genocide. So depending on which scholar's talking, there are certain ones that seem to pass the bar. But if we were to go to Winnipeg today and we were to go to their Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, they have a very prominent display of the Holodomor, which is the Ukrainian famine, and you won't see that in a lot of other museums. And why is it there? Well, the reality is there's a large Ukrainian expatriate community that they were very much affected by that historical experience, and their community was, and they wanted that to be expressed. And so I think, again, it's less about saying, oh, does that qualify or not by the definition, as to what were those events like and how did they affect those communities. And Elise and I have talked, right? We talked about if you look at Wounded Knee, right? Was it a battle of Wounded Knee? Then it becomes a massacre of Wounded Knee by a colonel who decided to disarm a group of Minneconjou Sioux under Bigfoot, and then they opened up with these guns and it became a massacre. And it was a completely avoidable massacre, but if I'm from that community, that's part of the history I want to be talked about. I want that to be prominent in my discussion. So again, I think that having those conversations and be willing to accept, that it's not easy to have those conversations is an important part of being an academic, but also being a person. And it's an important part of students in college, because if you can't, we live in what's known as the post-truth generation. We question every piece of evidence that we have. Well, we've got to be able to have people who can look at things and have those difficult discussions, because it's not going to get easier, it's only going to get harder.
So we have some questions that have come from public school teachers, and while we all work at the university level, I'm hoping that we can try and suss this out and help out the people that are in the K through 12 elementary school system. So this is a very insightful question from someone in the audience. The state of North Dakota will now require Holocaust studies in all schools. Looking at this audience, there are future elementary and high school educators. What are your suggestions for implementing curriculum that is age appropriate? Rebecca, do you want to start us?
Sure, and I'm not an expert on K-12 education at all, but I will just say from my own experience as a parent and working at the Holocaust Museum, they, before COVID, they haven't done it since COVID, but unfortunately, but they used to have a bring your kid to work day, like many workplaces do. So what does that look like when you bring your kid to the Holocaust Museum? Well, it was actually a fantastic program. When my daughter went, I think she was 8 years old. Were your girls there? They were, that same year, right?
They didn't go through the whole program.
Kierra's girls are a little bit younger than my daughter. So I think the age really does matter. And that there's, for the really little kids, like, maybe they don't need to learn about the Holocaust yet. Maybe it's okay to wait until they're a little bit older. So that's the first thing I would say. But I love your example of how you talk to your kids about difficult subjects in an age-appropriate way. And I'll just say, for the Bring Your Kid to Work Day, it was so age-appropriate, and it was beautiful, and the kids were really engaged. And what my daughter still talks about, the experience of hearing from one of our Holocaust survivor volunteers. There are a number of volunteers at our museum who are Holocaust survivors, and there's one in particular, her name is Susan Warsinger, and she professionally, before she retired, was, I think, a middle school teacher. So she really gets talking to kids. And she's just amazing. And her story that she told to these kids still has stuck with my daughter, like all these years later. So
I just want to let you know, Rebecca, we're having it again this year.
Oh, wonderful.
Yes. I was responsible for that, not like it. No, I'm just joking, Ed. But I do want to say, I just have to do this pitch because I work at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. We do have a ton of resources and tools for high school teachers. If anyone wants help tracking them down, please let me know. Just before this, Rebecca and I introduced a bunch of our resources, but we have the Belfar Institute, which is a 3-day async online teaching resource. And not only do you get the actual lessons, but you also get the materials that go with those lessons. It is free, and for many states, gets you continuing educational development course credits, so something to think about. And you have up to 6 months to do it, so you don't have to sit down and just do it all at that time. It will happen again this summer, so if you're thinking about it, please do sign up. But we also have, an entire web page that's on lesson plans, and that tells you what age. Those are made by people who left elementary school education and came to the museum. They are made by people who are still in the classroom that work with the museum to figure out what the best tools and resources are to teach these topics. And we also have a book list that breaks down what books are appropriate for what age. So honestly, if you have any questions, Professor Carpenter knows how to get a hold of me, and you guys can go ahead and reach out, and I will put you in contact with the right person who will be able to answer any questions that you have. Do you guys want to add to this?
I mean, I think I probably and again, approach it like very similarly in terms of like, but I think for me, like, and I'm mindful of this as both a parent and educator, is that children experience this, right? They lived through this, they survived, and some didn't. And I think to have, again, that empathy, right, or at least an understanding that other people's experiences are just fundamentally different than yours, simply in this context, right, because they were Jewish, I think it's important, right, because that's how we have these difficult conversations, right, where and Ed, it reminds me of some of the things you're talking about, like when we start to use language that describes the others, right, that's where like there's that slippery slope. And so I think for me, it's always, to me, I err on the side of like, it's always more important to share everything, and you can make that age appropriate. And I say that the reason why it's important is because, at least in the Indigenous context, I get those students at the college who are asking those questions, why was I never introduced to this? And that to me, I think, is always profound because, you know, I understand we have so much content, and especially K through 12, you have different like things that you're doing, state standards, like all these different like exams, right? But fundamentally, I think that idea of what do students need, right, to prepare them, not just to go to college, but to be really good citizens of the world.
Yeah, and when it comes to age appropriate, I actually have had a different experience. So I talked about our students, many of them single parents, working and going to school. And sometimes their childcare, their provider, maybe a family member is not available. They want to come to class. And they ask, you know, can I come, but I have to bring my son or my daughter. And I'm willing to allow that with depending on the class, and also with the trust you have with the student. So, you know, in this part of the class, we're going to be dealing with some pretty difficult kinds of issues. So, you know, are you sure that that's appropriate? And is there a time you want to take your son or your daughter out? Or this is where iPads and headphones are a great thing a lot of times, because you'll see a little head going down and in another world there, right? But that is an issue. You know, it speaks to some of the judgment that you don't want to traumatize children, especially as Rebecca talked about, because the Holocaust doesn't need to be taught to 5-year-olds, to 6-year-olds. It's just, you know, yeah, bullying can be taught, and guess what? Jewish kids got bullied in Nazi Germany. Okay, you can talk about that. It doesn't minimize the Holocaust. In many cases, ostracism and othering starts with bullying. Starts with being called names and getting beaten up. But, you know, I think that's where experience and judgment are really the kind of two things that you need to kind of develop that kind of feel for it. And there are just certain class periods where you know that you just can't afford to do it. It's just not right.
We have 1 minute left, and I'm not going to try and squeeze in one more question. So I'd like to ask you to please join me in thanking our speakers for coming to talk to you today.